President Trump is signaling that he's prepared to use either a hard or a soft strategy. And as a president, as a politician, not just a businessman, he's willing to use force in those negotiations as well. We have Israel as an active partner in this war. That signals actually a change within the Arab world. There had always been this fear that if Israel were actively fighting alongside the United States, this would cause a massive uprising. They're actually surprisingly supportive of what's going on right now.
Success on Trump's part might actually make Europe realize that it needs to pull its weight in relation to these geopolitical emergencies.
We are in NATO because we want to protect the continent of Europe. That's a friendship that's a one-way street. If the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, America will have enough energy. Europe, on the other hand, will either go without or will have to come crawling to the Russians.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Daniel McCarthy. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thanks, it's a delight to be here.
Great to have you back on. I always turn to you for some wisdom about the United States and the Trump administration and what's going on. And I want to talk to you a little bit about Iran and the war and what it says about the administration, what it says about America itself. And literally about an hour before we're speaking, Trump has issued a pretty extraordinary statement, essentially issuing a cease and desist in relation to strikes against Iranian energy infrastructure. He is intimating that there have been some pretty successful talks between America and Iranian officials, and therefore, for the foreseeable few days, there won't be strikes against actual energy infrastructure there. It seems a pretty important development. I wonder, what have you made of it? Where do you think the war is at right now?
Well, President Trump, I think, is signaling that he's prepared to use either a hard or a soft strategy. So if the Iranians want to negotiate, and I'm hopeful that they are in fact doing so, Trump is willing to listen. If, on the other hand, they want to reject negotiations, he's quite prepared to continue using force. So it's a simple matter of incentives, and I hope the Iranians, after several weeks of what they've experienced, have received the message loud and clear.
In relation to the war more broadly, or the very fact that Trump is doing what you're suggesting there, which is, either talk to us and carry on down the right road, or else we'll carry on with bombing. How much do you see this as a betrayal by Trump of some of the promises that he made in his presidential campaigns and the image that he presented as the man who would bring to an end the forever wars? I mean, you'll know there has been a lot of criticism of him, including from people in the MAGA camp, saying, "Oh, I thought we were, the right-wing peaceniks. Why are we suddenly doing what the neocons wanted us to do for so long, which is invade Iran, or rather, at least have airstrikes against Iran?" What have you made of that discussion about what it tells us about Trump and his principles?
Well, the flip side of that is that Trump has always been willing to use force against Iran. He's said so on the campaign trail. And of course, he actually demonstrated this during his first term, taking out one of the leaders of the IRGC. So Trump has signaled even to his own voters that this was something he was contemplating. His staffing decisions in his administrations, both the first and this current one, have included hawks as well as doves. And really, I think that's been Trump's overall presentation to the American people, that he's someone who is willing to consider all of his options. Unlike some of his predecessors, he does not have this ideological commitment to a sort of grand design for remaking things, but rather he does have this sense of, he comes from a background in business. He understands the need for negotiations. He understands the need for leverage in negotiations. And as a president, as a politician, not just a businessman, he's willing to use force in those negotiations as well. And that's what I think separates him from a lot of his, the previous administrations of the last 25 years. Some American conservatives, some Trump supporters do feel betrayed by this. But not all that many, according to the polling. So it seems as if perhaps 10% of self-identified Make America Great Again movement types, people who were hardcore Trump supporters, are not supportive of the war. A somewhat larger number of Republicans in general are not supportive. But in general, the MAGA movement supports it by about 90%, Republicans as a whole by about 80 to 85%. So most of the American right is quite united behind President Trump here.
Yeah, I often wonder if the discussion about a big MAGA split might be slightly overdone, and I think it probably is. One of the things that people have said about this Iran venture is that it's another Iraq. This is Iraq Part 2. It will be as disastrous as the Iraq War was, which I think kind of mystifies what's new and different about this intervention. What have you made of the comparisons to Iraq? Iraq was the war that you and I both criticized. Many people did. How do you see this one as being different, both in terms of why Trump did it and what the outcomes might be?
Well, it's significant that we don't have a large-scale land invasion going on here. So that distinguishes it not only from the 2003 Iraq War, but even from the 1991 Persian Gulf War that President George H.W. Bush fought. This is more of an air war, and in that sense, it is perhaps somewhat more similar to the campaign against Serbia that took place in the late 1990s under President Clinton. Also, we have Israel as an active partner in this war, which is interesting because, of course, that wasn't the case either in 1991 or in 2003. And that signals actually a change not only with respect to America and Israel, but also within the Arab world. That in the past, there had always been this fear that if Israel were actively fighting alongside the United States, this would cause a massive uprising throughout the Islamic world, and it would actually create domestic disasters for a number of Arab states and perhaps even for Israel itself. And that's not the case now, and I think that's because of the success of the Abraham Accords during President Trump's first administration. So it seems as if the Arab world, they're actually, surprisingly supportive of what's going on right now. We keep hearing that Saudi Arabia, for example, is encouraging President Trump to continue the war and to finish the job, so to speak. So I think all that is quite a different strategic and political environment than we looked at in 2003. And again, the fact that, this is a war that's about incentives and ultimately about negotiation rather than about a grand design for trying to plant democracy in the Middle East makes it, I think, a war that has a greater chance of succeeding practically than the campaign against Saddam Hussein in 2003, which did succeed, of course, in getting rid of Hussein, but did not succeed in creating this kind of democratic oasis in the Middle East that many Americans had hoped for.
Um, I want to come back to that question in a moment about the wars, whether the war will succeed and so on. But just to stick with Trump for a moment, what is it about Iran that gets Trump going, do you think? Because you've mentioned there he's intervened twice while he's been in power. People have been digging up old quotes of his from ancient interviews going back many, many years in which he has attacked Iran and said they're treating us badly. He seems to have an issue with Iran's psychological impact on America, which I think is quite a clever way of understanding this relationship. What is it, if we accept that he hasn't had this Damascene conversion to neocon hawkery, and I don't think he has, what is it about Iran in particular that makes him think actually, firing a few missiles might be a good idea?
Well, one thing that Trump understands very well is this notion of prestige, and he recalls vividly, I think, the humiliation that America endured in 1979 when the Islamic Revolution happens in Iran. They take hostages, they take American diplomats hostages. Um, President Jimmy Carter tries to intervene and rescue those hostages. It's a disaster. We lose a helicopter in Iran. Trump lived through all of that as a quite young man, and that's been partly formative experience for him. And he sees that Iran is a regime that's been hostile to us for nearly half a century now, and that up until now, American administrations have been feckless. They've made concession after concession to Iran, and Iran, is not only a state which has caused trouble for America in the past, but of course, it is a revolutionary, ideologically hardcore Islamist state, which has tried to export its extremism abroad, certainly within its own region, supporting Hezbollah, supporting Hamas, and any number of other terrorist groups. And it has been a serious nuisance, certainly, to its own neighbors. And Trump sees this as being, I think he sees it almost from the perspective of a landlord. Trump has a background, of course, in real estate. He sees Iran as being like a crack house in the neighborhood where a gang has squatted within a territory that was not being, within a property that was not being properly looked after. And now it is spreading its disorder to its own region and is basically defying any kind of landlord or any kind of authority to come in and try to restore order. And Trump sees himself as a landlord par excellence, someone who's going to clean out a bad neighborhood and make it a prosperous neighborhood instead.
One of the criticisms that we've heard from the left in the UK, I'm sure in America as well, is they will call this war unprovoked. They say it's an illegal war. I mean, the speed with which they make this decision that it's illegal, it has always mystified me. I don't quite know where they get their authority to make such swift judgments about a conflict. But what have you made of that discussion? Because, of course, those are terms that we heard in relation to Iraq in 2003, less so in relation to the Afghan war, because it came in the aftermath of 9/11, and most people accepted America had a right to respond in some way to that act of barbarism. But what have you made of that discussion in relation to Iran? It's unprovoked, it's illegal, it's wrong, we shouldn't be doing it. Is that a left-wing argument in the US, and how is it going down?
It is a left-wing argument in the U.S., although what's interesting is that just a few weeks ago, before the war with Iran began, I actually heard a former Democratic State Department official, someone who had worked for the Bill Clinton administration and then subsequently the Joe Biden administration, actually say at a lunch event that he thought the Democratic Party had been hampered by this kind of mythological belief in international law and this overconfidence in international law. And he was very critical, actually, of the Barack Obama administration, which he thought had always looked down on alumni of the Clinton administration because the Clinton administration had waged a war in Serbia, which again, many people on the left had claimed was an illegal war. And if you look at the history of American presidents, they have often engaged in wars which have been criticized by certainly the Democratic Party and by the left as being illegal or undeclared. President Reagan, for example, when he sent U.S. troops into Grenada and freed U.S. Medical students in Grenada from a communist regime that had seized power there, that was another undeclared war. The left said, "Oh, this is terrible. This is illegal." But of course, President Reagan accomplished what he set out to do, and that was a victory for the United States, and it was a success for freedom as well, not just for the American medical students who were liberated, but also for the island of Grenada, which was liberated from communism. So I think that, ordinary Americans are not concerned about this, but it's more rather that you have leftists either in Britain or in America or anywhere else who just like to use this as a kind of cover because what they're really saying is, they will disdain and despise Donald Trump no matter what. And that actually, given a choice between Ayatollahs and President Trump, they will prefer the Ayatollahs actually, and they are, they see America as always the bad guy in the world, even if it's up against a regime, as totalistic as that of Islamist Iran.
Yeah, we've had people on the streets of London over the past few days chanting victory to Iran, which, takes you from merely criticizing Western intervention into the realm of supporting a kind of Ayatollah-based dictatorship. So very foolish slogan to come out with. Um, I wanted to ask you what you think the relationship is at the moment between America and Israel. It can be very difficult to read. We hear all sorts of different arguments about it. Some people will say that Israel is leading America by the nose into these pointless, infernal wars. Other people will say actually America still has the upper hand. And we saw Trump publicly rebuking Netanyahu a couple of days ago over the attack on one of Iran's gas fields. Um, how do you understand that relationship? Is this a blossoming of that relationship, or is it maybe the final cry of a unity between America and Israel that might actually be fizzling out in some way?
Well, Israel certainly has its interests in fighting Iran, and it's very existentially concerned not only about the possibility of Iran rebuilding its nuclear program, but also about the danger that Iran's missiles pose. So the missiles themselves may not be an existential danger to Israel, but they are something that helps to raise the penalty, basically, for Israel trying to prevent Iran from proceeding with its nuclear program. They basically give Iran a degree of cover, which Iran then uses to support not only its nuclear program, but also terrorism against Israel, including support for Hamas and Hezbollah. So Israel has perfectly good reasons for wanting to have a showdown with Iran and wanting to end this problem that Iran has presented for a very long time. And it sees the United States quite naturally as an invaluable ally in this. And Netanyahu has certainly been lobbying President Trump rather. Excuse me, that's definitely a a slip that many leftists will call out. But in any case, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been lobbying President Trump for a good long time here to get into the war. But President Trump is not anybody's pushover, and clearly he has already said, going back decades, going back to the 1980s even, that he sees Iran as a menace, as something to be dealt with. He doesn't like, unresolved problems, and he's trying to resolve problems both in the Western Hemisphere in places like Venezuela and Cuba, as well as in Iran. So ultimately, Trump made his own decisions here, and Trump has, advisors around him who are not just patsies for Israel or anything like that. It's more of a conspiracy theory, I think, if people say that Israel somehow duped or manipulated America into this. And in fact, the reality that Israel and the United States are fighting together in this openly is actually, again, a development that we haven't seen in previous wars in the Middle East. And it's something that actually, I think is an advancement, even you could call it a blossoming of this U.S.-Israel relationship, because Israel, we're basically saying, look, you have a stake in this, and we therefore expect you to be doing some fighting. In fact, a lot of the fighting. And this, of course, is an argument that President Trump has also made to the Europeans and to the Japanese, all of whom actually depend much more on oil coming through the Persian Gulf than the United States itself does. And so there's still a sense in which Europe and Japan are free riding on the war fighting that the United States and Israel are undertaking here. But I don't think this is a case of Israel sort of duping America into going to war. This is something that, President Trump has had on his mind for some time. And he basically, I think, it may be that Netanyahu conveyed a sense of urgency to Trump that made him want to do it sooner rather than later. But it's clear that this is something that Trump has been thinking about for a very long time.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely smacks of a conspiracy theory when people say, the Jewish state is telling America what to do. Um, you talk about how the relationship between America and Israel is being solidified in some ways through this war, because they are fighting side by side in a way that hasn't happened all the time in the past. But what do you think are Israel's long-term prospects in the American imagination? Because one thing that concerns me as someone who's supportive of Israel is that there is this growing wariness of Israel among certain constituencies, not only on the left, but increasingly on sections of the right, especially digitally. There's a lot of digital right wingers who hate Israel almost more than the left does. And generationally as well, in the United States and similarly in Europe, the younger you go down in opinion polls, the more hostile people become towards Israel. So is Israel fighting a losing battle to maintain respect in America, or is that overdone, do you think?
Well, I think the Israelis had to make a very tough choice, knowing that getting into this war would necessarily accelerate some of this anti-Semitism that you find on the left as well as on the right, both in the United States and in Europe. And they made the choice that that was, as painful as that would be, the alternative of having Iran continue to cause the kinds of trouble that it was causing and to potentially grow wealthier and more capable of causing mischief in the future, that was something that Israel found even less acceptable. So if rising anti-Semitism is the price that's paid for a war that tries to deal with an actual military and terroristic threat within the immediate neighborhood of Israel, the Israelis seem to be willing to accept that. Now, I think you're quite right that demographically, you look at any number of trends, you look at the sort of change in religion, the change in population in the United States and in Western Europe. And it looks like a very dark picture in terms of support for Israel, that you have, more and more people who are either indifferent to Israel or, in fact, hostile to it, partly with the growth of Islamic immigration, Muslim immigration, but partly also you have people from other parts of the world who, for various complicated reasons, either are just indifferent to Israel or even quite hostile to it. And of course, it's become this kind of fashionable left-wing attitude that you find in Ireland, you find it, in much of Latin America as well, simply to hate Israel to kind of prove that you're a good leftist, you're a good anti-colonialist. So this is a real ideological threat, and it's going to continue building. And I think Israel is going to, is thinking that as bad as that is, that's something to be dealt with in the future, and they're going to have to find a new, sort of publicity and rhetorical strategy to deal with that. But in the immediate present, they are dealing with a military and terrorist threat, which is connected, of course, to the October 5th attacks. This is something that Israel has decided is a higher priority, that Iran is not just an anti-Semitic state, but it's a state which is weaponizing that anti-Semitism in terms of actual violence and support for terrorism against Israel.
You've touched already on us freeloaders in Europe and other parts of the world who are free riding, at least, on America and Israel's willingness to fight against a common enemy. What is the view of someone like Keir Starmer in the United States? Trump has made some very funny comments, and he has said, we're not dealing with Churchill here. And I think everyone would agree with that. But, I have been quite shocked, I have to say, by just the dithering nature of Starmer and his inability to say anything, whether to strongly oppose what's happening or to throw his lot in with it or to assist our allies in the way that Trump is clearly expecting him to. What's the reading of Starmer in American circles right now?
Yeah, among the American general public, I think there's extremely little awareness of Starmer whatsoever. So he is a non-entity as far as most Americans are concerned. Obviously, Americans who are much more, aware of the news and the world, the American elite, I think they too see Starmer as, someone who's very, very much not a factor in either war or peace decisions, and someone who has made Britain very marginal to any kind of consideration that's going on, whether it's, again, whether it's fighting the war, whether it's trying to bring about negotiations. Starmer is just, an asterisk. He is a footnote to what's going on. Even with respect to Europe, Starmer just doesn't seem to be a major player or someone who's able to kind of wield any kind of influence that has a material effect on things. And I think there's, in some ways, more interest among Americans in what Japan is thinking than there is in what Britain is thinking at this point. And that's kind of a sad commentary on the state of the U.S.-UK relationship. But, Starmer, I think both domestically in the UK and also on the international stage is seen as someone who's a failure. And there's just kind of an impatience for him to get off the stage so that Britain can have at least some kind of direction again that is not simply entropic and a state of decay.
Yeah, a lot of people in Britain feel the same impatience. We want him to get off the stage and let someone else have a go. Um, what about Europe more broadly? Because there's been a kind of simmering hostility between America and Europe over the past year or so. Lots of tensions, lots of name calling, lots of clashes over various questions, various issues. Um, my initial thought is that the war in Iran would explode those things and make them worse. But I'm now wondering if success on Trump's part, whatever that might end up looking like, might actually put Europe back in its box, make it realize that it needs to pull its weight in relation to these geopolitical emergencies. So it's kind of hard for me to read what might come next in the America-Europe relationship. How do you see that playing out right now?
I think the implications for NATO are absolutely tremendous here. So I think a lot of Europeans, and I was talking to a German friend just a week or so ago. Europeans like to pretend that because NATO is a defensive alliance, it's somehow equally a defense for the European continent and for the United States, which of course is hogwash. The United States does not need NATO in order to defend North America. On the contrary, Europeans need NATO and they need the United States to defend Europe. And so it's, when Europeans say, well, NATO is a defensive alliance, we're not under any obligation to come and help you with the war against Iran. There are sort of two things that Americans are hearing when Europeans say that. One is that, when Europeans could actually potentially be helpful to the United States, they're just not willing to be generous. They're not willing to do something that would be an act of friendship and an act of actual military support for the United States in Iran. The second thing that Americans are hearing is that the Europeans continue to think that America is responsible for keeping the world's waterways safe, including the waterways on which Europe itself depends, such as the Persian Gulf, which Europe is depending upon for fuel. And so Americans are saying, wait a minute, I mean, we are treated like dirt. We don't get any kind of help from the Europeans when we actually could use it. And instead, the Europeans simply rely on us to continue to be basically their unpaid policemen, keeping the oil flowing to them no matter what. And this really raises some serious questions because America is in NATO not out of self-interest, but really out of an act of altruism. We are in NATO because we know the Europeans need it, and we generally feel benevolent towards Europeans, and we want to protect the continent of Europe. And if the Europeans don't have the same sort of benevolence towards us when we could actually, wish we could count on their assistance, then, that's a friendship that's a one-way street. And I think that's going to make Americans, I mean, it has already made Americans rethink the value of something like NATO, which again, that's protecting Europe. That's not really protecting North America. It's certainly, it's not that the United States is depending on Britain or Italy or anyone else in order to, help us win wars. We rather are the necessary, sort of superpower to help defend Europe against the numerous, risks that are posed by Russia and others. So I think the Europeans need to think very carefully here, and Japan does as well, about how American leaders as well as the American public are responding to this kind of, washing of one's hands that Europe and Japan are displaying towards a conflict where America could actually not only use their help, but really, ideally, it should be the powers that are actually economically dependent on trade from the Persian Gulf who are responsible for policing the Persian Gulf and who are carrying, a lot of the weight there. And the United States should certainly be capable of helping, but the United States should not be the one primarily responsible for this. And if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, America will have enough energy. It may spike energy prices, but we will not go without fuel. Europe, on the other hand, will either go without or will have to, come crawling to the Russians, which is the last thing the Europeans should want to do. So it's a real, crisis point for NATO, and I think the Europeans they're dithering. They are presenting a face of sort of ungenerosity as well as weakness, and that's going to do long-term damage to the alliance.
Yeah, I mean, it must be so frustrating for Americans to see all this anti-Americanism coming out of the European chattering classes at the same time as Europe remains reliant on America essentially to fight its wars and to protect its continent. So I can imagine that would cause a lot of resentment. um, I wanted to ask you geopolitically about other factors that might be relating to the Iran conflict. Some commentators have said that fundamentally this is about China, um, as much as it might be about Iran, in the sense that this is Trump's attempt not only to defeat the Islamic Republic and the threat that it poses regionally and globally, but also to temper China's influence in that part of the world, to weaken one of its allies, one of its friends, one of its partners. How much do you read? I mean, and one could have said similarly about Venezuela in relation to Trump's decapitation of the Maduro regime was driven by broader geopolitical concerns as well. How do you see that playing out in the Iran theater?
Yeah, my own view is that it is more significant in the Western Hemisphere. So I think President Trump is quite determined to keep Chinese influence out of Latin America. It is probably something that is in the back of the mind of President Trump and some of his staff with respect to Iran as well. It's a good way of showing that, China can't use Iran or other states as proxies to, just stir up trouble and inconvenience the United States and its allies. So I think there is an element of that, but I think it's probably not even close to being in the top 10 of the objectives and motives behind the current war.
Right. Okay, that's useful. Okay, Daniel, I want to ask you about where you think the war might go next. The thing that's quite has shocked me has been the anti-war catastrophism around this, and I say that as someone who's been very critical of wars over the years and written about them and even marched against a couple of them. But there's a catastrophism around this discussion that I find incredibly unnerving because, and you feel it particularly with the BBC. I don't know if it's similar with media outlets in the US, but you feel almost that they want Trump to get a bloody nose, or they want Israel and America to be taught a lesson. You can kind of feel that coming through the commentary where the war is talked about as completely disastrous. We're already losing. The Islamic Republic is going to come out emboldened and stronger than ever. And they're almost willing that into existence. I wonder, have you seen a similar dynamic in sections of the American media? And what have you made of that kind of anti-war catastrophism that seems to be surrounding some of the discussion here?
Oh, I have, and in fact, a different German friend of mine, who actually is on the left, but is an old school Marxist and not one of these sort of multicultural globalists of the 21st century. But this friend of mine, sent me an email and said, "Am I crazy to think that everyone is preemptively adopting a catastrophic mindset over this?" And I said, "No, I think you're exactly right. That's the way the media is presenting this. That's the way the left has kind of hyped this narrative." They see it, America had lost from day one. according to their view. And Iran is this mighty, powerful state. And yet it's surprising because, of course, Iran is, in their narrative, both this extremely powerful state, but also it's nothing to worry about, right? So, I mean, one of the things I've thought is very, very ironic is if their narrative is actually true and Iran is as tough a cookie as they're saying, that actually does more to justify the war that the United States and the United States and Israel are waging against Iran, because that means that Iran genuinely is a very dangerous power, that it has this ability to, resist attacks while at the same time being capable of developing nuclear weapons and sponsoring terrorism and basically acting in an offensive manner. So I think that narrative, really is counterproductive for the very people who are making it. And of course, there's so many other delicious ironies here. So isn't it wonderful to see how concerned suddenly the global left is, and perhaps the Anglo-American left in particular, how it's suddenly so concerned about fossil fuel markets, right? So for decades, the left has been working to eliminate the use of fossil fuels, even if it winds up, throwing Germany, for example, back into the Stone Age. If you're getting rid of fossil fuels and you're also getting rid of nuclear power, then what the heck is Germany going to use for energy? Well, suddenly, all of the leftists who previously were Greens and previously were environmentalists and wanted to get beyond fossil fuels and were eager to adopt, deliberate policies domestically that would cut down on fuel consumption and make heating much more expensive for everyone. Now they're suddenly weeping tears of blood over the fossil fuel industry and the fact that fuel is not as easily available now, and that we can't use as much fossil fuel as we were using just a month and a half ago or so. I think that is it's really revealing about exactly what the left's priorities are. That environmentalism is really about inflicting pain upon Westerners themselves, and that's the chief objective. And but it's a slightly lower objective for them than trying to humiliate Donald Trump and maybe the United States and Israel in particular. And the left is actually, again, as you mentioned earlier, sort of celebrating this idea that they want Iran to win. They are actually pro-Iranian here. And that, again, I mean, it's something we've seen over and over uh, in the course of the various conflicts the United States has been involved in, going back half a century and more. And I mean, the Vietnam War was a disaster. It's a war I think America should never have fought or got into. And yet, it certainly is true that many of the anti-war marchers who were opposing the Vietnam War, a lot of them were not against the war. They were not just lamenting that America got drawn into a quagmire it couldn't get out of. They were actually in favor of the Vietnamese communists, and they were literally anti-American. So it's one of the sort of harsh realities of the world that so many times there is a confusion and an admixture of genuine, authentic criticism of war and realistic concern about its objectives and its plausibility and its costs. That unfortunately gets mixed together with people who really do just have a malicious view towards the West, towards Israel, towards the United States, and towards Donald Trump.
And it seems pretty clear to me that a lot of the opposition to the Iran war is now bound up with that kind of anti-Westernism, that kind of anti-Americanism. They're becoming increasingly indistinguishable, I think. Um, yeah, and it's so frustrating listening to British leftists in particular, who spent the past 30 years demanding that we don't drill for oil, we don't dig for coal, we should never dig up any fossil fuels, and now they're all crying into their cappuccinos because we can't get the energy that we need. It's very, very annoying. Um, okay, Daniel, my last question for you is just about how you think this might play out, or maybe how you would like it to play out, because it seems to me the stakes in this conflict were always very high, because we're talking about a pretty existential conflict between Israel and the Islamic Republic, and America is now throwing its weight behind Israel. But I think the stakes are also pretty high on the home front as well, because it seems unquestionable to me that there are elements in our society that want Trump to do badly in order to clip the wings of Trumpism and clip the wings of populism. So it's become bound up with some of these kind of domestic narratives as well. So it seems to me the stakes are quite high. I wonder, how would you like this war to proceed? How would you like it to end? What to you would look like a victory for, I guess, America and Israel and the West more broadly?
Yeah, I think what's already been accomplished is very significant in terms of stripping Iran of a navy, stripping it of an air force, stripping it of several layers of its top leadership, including Ayatollah Khamenei, and also, Iran's missile capability, especially its long-range missiles, has been weakened, if not eliminated. So all of those things are already elements of success for the United States and Israel. Obviously, at the same time, Iran has demonstrated that it does have offensive capabilities with its drones and certainly being able to hold the world hostage by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. Those things have demonstrated certain degrees of strength with Iran. On the other hand, I mean, in a way, these were things that have been known about. The prospect of Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz has been a concern for decades. I mean, going back to the 2000s at least. And now we see exactly how that plays out and, exactly how much leverage it gives Iran. I don't think it gives Iran nearly as much leverage as the left is saying in both the United States and Israel. But now we basically know what the price tag is. And, ideally, we want a resolution at the end of this conflict where Iran will not be able to do these things in the future. Iran, of course, sees that its capacity to hold the Strait of Hormuz hostage is really its only guarantee of regime survival. So one of the things that I think will have to be negotiated here is basically the United States and Israel saying, okay, we have to get rid of, your nuclear enrichment. We have to make sure you can never have it. We also have to limit or eliminate your ballistic missile program. And ideally, we'd like to get rid of your ability to hold the Strait of Hormuz hostage. The Iranians, on the flip side, will say, well, we're not going to eliminate our capabilities with respect to the Strait of Hormuz because that is our lifeline. We're depending on that. But perhaps, even if they are able to keep that, they will be, compelled now to negotiate about, in a very serious way, about their, nuclear program and about their missiles. And then, I think there's an awareness on all sides that, you want to get this completely resolved, with this conflict. Because if it's not, there clearly will be more wars in the future. Israel is very concerned that you have a regime that is ideologically, has been opposed to Israel from the beginning for 50 years now almost, and that, basically calls for the destruction of Israel, and that, takes actions to further harm to Israel in terms of supporting terrorism and, of course, ultimately developing nuclear weapons. People forget, Israel is a very, very small state. So even though it has nuclear capability itself, most of its population is concentrated in a very narrow strip of land in a very few cities. And basically, Iran is the opposite. It is a huge landmass. It has the potential, to develop nuclear sites throughout a very large country. And so if there were ever, God forbid, a nuclear exchange between those two countries, geography would be very much on the side of Iran, and you would have, just an extraordinary price that Israel would pay. And that means that even if you don't get to the point of an actual nuclear exchange, Iran would ultimately have a lot of power to blackmail Israel, to prevent Israel from taking strong measures against terrorists, either in the Palestinian territories or elsewhere. This is something that Israel, recognizes as a long-term, knife being held against its neck. So Israel is trying everything possible right now to solve this problem while it is still solvable, while the Iranians do not have a nuclear weapon, while Iran has not been normalized. I think the Israelis are very concerned, of course, about this long-term trajectory in the West, which may create a more sort of hostile climate of opinion towards Israel and a more favorable climate of opinion towards Iran, which would then, of course, strengthen Iran and make a future war like this one much more difficult for Israel to prosecute. So Israel and the United States both have strong, motives for wanting to resolve this once and for all with this conflict. I think the Iranians, having, seen exactly how much pain and how many layers of their leadership can be destroyed by the U.S. and Israel, and by the willingness that Israel and U.S. Still have to continue this war if necessary, I think the Iranians have a very strong incentive now to negotiate in a much more serious way than they ever have before. So I'm hopeful that you will get to a resolution here where even if the Iranians, continue to have some leverage over the Strait of Hormuz, they will, once and for all try to deal with this nuclear and missile problem, which they have been posing towards Israel and ultimately towards the United States and beyond. Of course, the missile program is also, something that is not only a concern for Israel, it's a concern for all of Iran's neighbors who've been, getting hit by Iran during this war. And ultimately, it's a concern, I think it should be a concern for Europe, because Europe is going to be in the range, if it's not in range now, of some of the most long-range Iranian missiles. As those missiles continue to develop, it's going to be, Europe will also be capable of being held hostage, and ultimately perhaps even the United States. So this is, again, it's bad enough that we have one North Korea, and North Korea is a very isolationist state for a number of reasons. Iran is not an isolationist state. It is a truly revolutionary state that wants to export radicalism in every way that it can. So Iran, I think, poses a number of problems even beyond what we see with North Korea. And the idea of having a North Korea in the Middle East is bad enough, but again, a North Korea that's also evangelical in terms of terrorism and in terms of trying to spread radicalism through religion, that is a threat that we haven't seen before.
Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank you.